Well, I think one of the important things is you know, of course, non-disclosure agreements and other things to at least get something down in writing. I know that a lot of people, they come to Asia and they believe that a lot of business is done on a handshake, and that's not really true. To some extent, you may simplify agreements, and it's a wise idea, you know, if you had something that was maybe a 40-page NDA or some other kind of, you know, document, to simplify it down, reduce its size, and maybe you stick some of the details into attachments. But you really can't do business just on a handshake, and you can't just trust people. You can't just give them your important ideas without having some sort of understanding that's recorded, you know, between the two, to show that you know and they know that what you're giving to them is supposed to be, you know, kept in confidence or kept for the right time, or not used by them without, you know, there being, you know, some sort of appropriate further relationship.
How did it come to this? I mean, is it a cultural thing that's just everybody accepts it? Or is there a certain, I guess, ultra level of competitiveness, which is simply unique to the country, where everybody is really out to get whatever they can?
Taiwan a little bit less so. I mean, I've seen a bit, you know, more care and honor and I don't know what, but you know, it's not quite as, you know, several years ago there was a UN drafted crime report, you know, a report on, you know, West African crime organizations, and they were looking through sort of the causes of this, and I could see this resonate a bit in Asia as well. Is that, you know, for example, in mainland China, you have a lot of very sudden increase in wealth. You have a lot of people who break the rules and make enormous fortunes, and people see that and they feel inside, they feel that, like, you know, well, these guys, they became billionaires by like totally doing crazy things, and why should that hold me back? And they've also seen extraordinary wealth be easy come, easy go. And so the idea that, um, well, you know, if a person who works all his life to become successful as a dentist, a doctor, or an engineer, or something like that, can have everything lost all at once, you know, then why is it that, you know, I should really care? If they just, you know, why should I care about doing things the hard way and doing things the careful and honorable and, you know, kind and nice way? And I think maybe Taiwan has, because of, perhaps because of its 50 years of being a Japanese colony, developed a little bit more of a sense of kind of this, oh, you know, we do things the hard way sort of approach. And I think China is a little bit more in that sudden wealth, you know, phase. And I think that's made an important cultural difference in the business climates for each one.
Things have also changed over the years, right? I mean, you moved to China, you studied in China, you understand the culture very well, intimately on the ground. Where are we currently at compared to where we used to be? What are some of the future developments you'll see?
In the past 25 years, I've seen an extraordinary change. I remember, you know, in the 1990s, in fact, the first ever time I went to mainland China was to attend a technology and law conference. And, you know, so I kind of jumped into that stuff fairly early, even when I was a law student. And previously, when I was a journalist before going to law school, I'd worked for business publications, writing about, you know, where things were going with the industries, and I felt that things were really going to take off. But where I saw, you know, when I lived in China in the 1990s, there was, you know, for example, there was a plan to put together an intellectual property conference, and the several of the Supreme Court judges in China were interested in participating in this. And but IP in those days was such a sensitive issue that the government actually shut that one down and just said, this is too controversial. And, you know, I think, you know, in truth, IP became more important. And that's one of the most important things about China, is to see that, like, you know, most disputes in intellectual property are between local, you know, citizens and local companies. And dealing with that as a societal issue and as an investment issue and as a matter of just like rewarding innovation is absolutely essential. Now in Taiwan, they went through a little bit of a different process. but there were massive improvements, and I see this on both sides, is that the admission on the same day to the WTO ensured that you know you know, we had a common vocabulary for talking about trade issues and to try to find a way to deal with issues, you know, and especially from the US side or from the European side. You know, we'd see that we used to get played off against each other a lot. So the Taiwan government in the old days used to say like, oh, the Europeans are fine with this, or they'd say the Americans are fine with this. And we just had to get on the same page.
So in actual fact, you weren't fine with it. But there was the
Oh
assumption.
no, that was, and it was actually fun because there was a couple of years in there where you know, shortly after I arrived into Taiwan, where I was drafting the position papers for both the European Chamber and the American Chamber, and so I kind of made them mirror each other. And then, you know, subsequently, I always checked in, you know, just to make sure. It's like, you know, go talk to, because I chair the IP committee for the European Chamber, although I'm an American. But I also check in with my, you know, the AmCham colleagues, and just make sure, because it's important that we don't get played off against each other. I think it's wise, because, you know, it's like when we advance protections for everybody, I mean, you know, it's like a rising tide raises all the ships.
You made the point that in mainland China, most of the IP cases are between locals. So one would assume from that it is taken much more seriously now than when China entered the WTO several decades ago. But do you get the sense that foreigners still are at a disadvantage, as common conception seems to be?
Yeah, yeah, it's there can be issues. There can be also misunderstandings, but I think you know, in China, I mean, for example, there are tragedies on a vast level, you know, but I do see like some improvements. I mean, a lot of people were faulting, for example, they noticed right in and around the same time that Trump got his trademarks approved, because he was a famous person when he got elected president. He might have been famous before then, but being elected president really makes you internationally famous. But there were a lot of other companies like Martin Guitars and you know, Jordan, you know, the basketball player, not the you know, not not the
Not the
model,
country, right?
yeah, or the country, right? So I think, like, you know, there was this period of about 6 to 8 months right in and around 2016 and 2017 where it was a massive improvement. But in both cases, international trade, you know, it's really important for that to be a huge inducement. Special 301, for example, Taiwan really wanted to solve its 301 problem and was very motivated to start listening to people about how to fix that. And in mainland China too, I mean, it's still just a massive problem. Sometimes the problems change, so you have sometimes industry shaping things. And I also worry about the patent sector quite a bit, because, you know, given the amount of work that we do. So I guess, like, you know, if you were to think about, like, say, Special 301, you know, the 301 process is through the U.S. Trade Representative's office. And it's a way by which they list countries that don't have adequate intellectual property protections. And in the old days, one of the major problems that Taiwan had was that it was a huge center for production of you know, optical media products. And tied in with that, of course, is, like, you know, for software, for movies, for music, every, you know, all the copyrightable works. It was just, you know, pumping out vast amounts of discs into the world. And
Not necessarily legitimate ones, hence the concerns, presumably.
yes, there was a lot of terrible, you know, there was just, you know, and it eventually started to, you know, the formats started to change over time. And along the way, Taiwan took it into its head, you know, to even mess with the format itself, so that they were trying to, and this is where they got into a lot of trouble with the European Union. In fact, very early into the WTO time, you know, the European Commission rather, you know, brought a complaint against Taiwan in relation to optical media, because they were basically trying to compulsory license do compulsory licenses, and that was hurting Philips to the tune of about 500 million euros a year. So it was just huge,
And,
huge
and,
damages.
and of course, China being a very large market, their argument seems to be, we're so big, you need to play by our rules. I mean, you just look at the number of homegrown social media networks they have. They don't need Facebook and Twitter when they have their own versions with very substantial users. Taiwan, the opposite. Taiwan always looking to curry favor with countries overseas in order to get recognition of one sort or another. To what extent has this improved the playing field for people pitching their ideas, pitching their business plans, pitching their products into Taiwan, that they can expect a fairer deal because Taiwan really needs them?
I think there's a lot of good faith that Taiwan ends up trying to show, because they are somewhat dependent, and there's definitely a relationship with several of the Western countries that's essential, with the United States on defense, or with the UK and elsewhere. There's also big markets. In many cases, Taiwan has a favorable trade relationship with a lot of these places, and the connection between Taiwan's semiconductor area with that of the UK and the United States, and with Europe broadly, with the automakers in Germany and in the United States, as well as with Silicon Valley. There's so many companies that design chips and can trust Taiwan. They send it to here, and if you were to think of Taiwan as being a little bit like sort of like Switzerland, in the sense of it can be a trustworthy place to send your IP, and these foundries like TSMC, or like the other ones that are here. Shinju is basically, like, you imagine a bunch of like monastic scribes dutifully making their copies, just like the Irish monasteries of old, or these other places that had specialized in making perfect copies of everyone's books. And then, of course, we keep one, we give, but in Taiwan, they're very, very, this honor sense in and around the semiconductor, industry is extremely key.
Not always the case, though. And there was a particular example that you have where things didn't go wrong during the pitching process, but actually during the post-manufacturing testing process of chips.
Right. So, what we ran into was a Silicon Valley client, which had become a household name for gamers, because gamers care a lot about the graphics and making things like work in the right order, or else like you get stuck on a level, or you can't quite shoot or jump as quickly as you'd like to. And that's why there's a massive market for gamer mice and controllers and keyboards and computers and screen. Anyway, it's a very picky audience. And so in this case, what the client had become aware is that electronic shops all over Taiwan and the PRC had become absolutely filled up with boxes of supposedly their product being sold by graphics card makers that they had never heard of. And so that was a big deal to them. It was like, wait, who are these guys? And getting a handle on that was really important.
And the handle you did get on it. Surprisingly, though, it seems that it wasn't that these were cheap knockoffs of the original gaming chips, but they were actually the real gaming chips. How did that happen?
Right. So it's kind of like the creepy urban legend about like the calls are coming from within the house, It was this, it was like something's wrong, because once we went all over China, we went all over Taiwan, to all the electronic markets, brought back the samples. The client, took them all apart. And, if you know how, like, chip packaging, it's like once you pop it open, you start stripping things down, and you're like, oh, and they looked at it under the right kinds of microscopes, and they figured out these look to be our chips. And they knew something was wrong, because, where could the chips be coming from? They went to TSMC. TSMC was their foundry that was making them. And TSMC was very pleasant. They're very easy. They're like one of the most honorable counterparties. If you ever have to deal with a problem, you go to them, and their reaction time was extremely swift, because they took it seriously, and they were wondering, like, where the heck, who's been stealing the chips out of our process? And while they were doing that, we, of course, were trying to think about the different ways we could take action. I mean, obviously there's trademarks all over the packaging that these were things that were being sold in the electronic markets. There was the driver software, which the copyright belonged to our client. The driver software was loaded up on these disks that people could put into computers in those days. And, but TSMC started their investigation, and it was a funny time because I had actually spent several years working in the United States on the IBM semiconductor toxicological tort litigation. And when I was, back in the US, flying back over to East Fishkill or going over to, Armonk and White Plains and other kind of IBM locations in those days, I'd learned a lot about how chips were made. And it occurred to me that, maybe these graphics cards, these graphic chips were being stolen out of the process in and around the inspection phase. And TSMC focused in their investigation onto the inspection phase, and they found that there were 2 workers from a contractor who had been like pocketing vast numbers of chips. Probably what they were doing, I mean, in the thinking, because you can't examine all of them, you can't quality test every single one of them, but the sense was that these were chips that were maybe close to fail or just over the line. They were maybe a little too slow to be, good enough, but probably adequate to sort of function and to trick a consumer. And some of them probably were totally functional chips that, were just written off as being, bad product.
Yeah.
And instead of grinding them up and destroying them like they were supposed to, these guys just pocketed vast numbers of them, tens of thousands of them, and leached them out into the markets. And that takes some real expertise to do. But the company those contractors work for, I don't think I can name, but it's they've got an industry reputation as jerks. So
right, and
not too surprised.
TSMC would obviously also have been concerned about its reputation.
Yes.
And when you think about that, again, from somebody who's looking to pitch to a prospective client in Taiwan, is the landscape such where people do care about their reputations? And okay, so you said earlier on, you need an NDA, you need to go into Taiwan like China and be very clear about what your expectations for your IP rights are. But it sounds that culturally, Taiwan is at least, people care enough about their reputations to take IP seriously.
Yeah. I think with a lot of Taiwan companies, and I've seen this, I've actually been pleasantly surprised, several times, where you get a hold of the CEO, you get a hold of the general counsel of a Taiwan counterparty, and and they come back and they do like the most honorable thing that they go beyond your expectations. And I think TSMC consistently is like that. There's in a completely different industry, in the tire industry, we had a confrontation with a CEO in which he came into our office and it basically acceded to all of our demands immediately because he was ashamed, and he was an honorable person, and he immediately set about rectifying the problem that his salespersons had created by spreading false information about some other, some mainland Chinese products he was trying to sell. And I was just like, and when I run across that, I see my faith in humanity restored. It's you get very cynical because I think law firms are often, a repository for people's troubles sometimes. But every once in a while you run across somebody who makes you actually smile and feel good about, like, oh, that, you, sir, are much better than I thought you would ever be. One of the most important things that a company needs to know when they do business out here is there's no such thing as striking a deal and then just leaving on its own. I know that it is sometimes very stressful and hard for people to like go through like dusty factory after dusty factory and do all these meetings and all the banqueting and I know that, of course, right now in COVID, that doesn't, happen as much as it used to, but you do need to really monitor your relationships with people, and you really can't just leave that alone, because people do realize that they know if manufacturers out here and business partners out here, they know if they're not being watched. And you have to keep up the relationship. You have to keep up the connection. You have to make sure that you have a good relationship with you, and that you can take what might have been an initial kind of foot in the door and turn it into something, a little bit closer. And it's important to keep in mind that, you get, a lot of family owned companies out here. So, and I've seen this repeatedly, is that, as a family owned company, there's even very, very large family owned companies, just like in Japan or in Korea. There's places where, the daughter is going to be the next CEO, the son is going to be the next CFO, and so on and so on. And you realize that it's like, the next generation may not be so nice. And, they sometimes, that second generation can be a lot greedier. And so you really then have to watch out when there's been a change in control within a family owned company. You really have to make sure that you keep an eye on what's going on, because that's usually around the time that ridiculousness ensues.